Welcome to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where tonight we'll journey through magical corridors, enchanted classrooms, and the peaceful grounds of the castle. Join us as we explore the wizarding world in a story designed to help you drift into a peaceful sleep. After our story concludes, you'll hear the gentle crackling of a common room fire to help you fall asleep. There will be no advertisements or interruptions, just the continuous, soothing sounds of flames to carry you into your dreams. Now take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let's begin our magical adventure. The golden glow of autumn sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Gryffindor Tower, casting long, warm patterns across the worn carpets and comfortable furnishings. Outside, the first leaves of the season had begun their gentle descent from the ancient trees, twirling and dancing in the breeze before settling on the grounds below. It was that perfect time of year at Hogwarts when the castle seemed to exhale after the excitement of the new term, settling into a peaceful rhythm that felt like coming home. The common room was especially inviting this afternoon, with a crackling fire lending its warmth to students scattered about in various states of study and relaxation. In one corner, nestled in two overstuffed armchairs by the hearth, sat Fred and George Weasley, identical grins playing across their freckled faces as they whispered conspiratorially to each other. "Do you think it'll work?" Fred murmured, his eyes darting briefly toward a delicate porcelain teacup sitting innocently on a nearby table. George's smile widened as he tucked his wand back into his robe. Only one way to find out, isn't there? The twins had been working on this particular bit of magic for weeks now, perfecting it in the quiet hours of the night when the dormitory was filled with the gentle breathing of their sleeping roommates. It wasn't their most ambitious prank, not by far, but there was something delightfully simple about it that appealed to them both. A teacup that vanished the moment someone tried to drink from it, only to reappear once set down again. The common room was filling up as afternoon classes ended, students dropping their heavy bags and sinking gratefully into chairs and couches. The enchanted teacup sat patiently, part of a tea service that had been brought up earlier by the house elves. Its white porcelain gleamed in the firelight, adorned with tiny painted roses and gold trim around the rim. Nothing about it suggested mischief. And that was precisely the point. Neville Longbottom was the first to approach the tea service, his round face flushed from the climb up the tower stairs. He poured himself a cup of the steaming amber liquid, added a generous spoonful of sugar, and settled into a chair near the window. The twins watched, barely containing their anticipation, as Neville raised the cup to his lips, and then, quite suddenly, there was no cup at all. Neville blinked in confusion as his fingers closed around thin air. A splash of tea appeared to hover momentarily before falling into his lap with a soft splatter. He jumped up with a startled yelp, looking bewilderedly at his empty hand and then at the damp patch on his robes. "What in Merlin's name?" he muttered, turning in a circle as if the teacup might be floating behind him. Fred buried his face in a cushion to muffle his laughter, while George affected an expression of innocent concern. "Everything all right there, Neville?" he called across the room. "I don't know what happened," Neville stammered, still looking for the vanished cup. "It was just here and then," he trailed off as his eyes landed on the tea table once more, where the teacup now sat, exactly as it had been before, pristine, filled with tea, completely ordinary. Neville approached it cautiously, as one might approach a creature that could bite. With hesitant fingers, he picked up the cup again, examining it from all angles. Finding nothing unusual, he brought it toward his mouth once more. For the second time, the cup vanished the moment it neared his lips. This time, Neville was prepared enough to avoid spilling the tea, but his expression of bewilderment only deepened. "I don't understand," he said to no one in particular, his voice a mixture of confusion and awe. "Is someone playing a joke?" By now, several other students had noticed Neville's predicament. Seamus Finnegan abandoned his transfiguration essay and came over to investigate. "Let me try," he said, reaching for the teacup that had once again reappeared on the table. The moment his fingers closed around the handle, Fred and George exchanged quick glances, struggling to maintain their composure. Seamus lifted the cup, turned it around, even peered inside. "Seems normal to me," he declared. But as he raised it to take a sip, the cup disappeared from his grasp as well, leaving him gaping at his empty hand. "Oh, blimey," Seamus exclaimed, a smile breaking across his face as he realized what was happening. "That's brilliant magic, that is." The commotion drew more attention. Soon a small crowd had gathered around the tea table, each student taking turns to witness the disappearing teacup trick. Some laughed outright when it vanished. Others tried various methods to outsmart the charm, drinking extremely quickly, approaching from different angles, even attempting to drink with their eyes closed, as if the cup might be too shy to vanish when not being watched. Hermione Granger observed the proceedings with a mixture of exasperation and reluctant admiration. "It's a disillusionment charm variant," she informed anyone who would listen, though she couldn't help smiling when Katie Bell shrieked with laughter as the teacup vanished just as she was about to take a sip. "Not exactly, Granger," Fred called from his armchair, finally giving up the pretense of innocence. "It's our own special blend of charms. We call it the invisible sip, or the disappearing drink, or the phantom pour," George interjected. "We haven't quite decided on the name yet." The atmosphere in the common room had shifted entirely. What had been a quiet afternoon of study had transformed into a gathering of shared amusement. Even the students who had initially been annoyed at the interruption were now taking their turns with the magical teacup, suggesting increasingly outlandish names for the trick. The vanishing vessel. The now you steep it, now you don't. The Koopa Nota. The armchairs and couches were rearranged into a loose circle around the tea table, and someone had brought out a plate of biscuits to accompany the ever-disappearing tea. The warm glow of the common room seemed to intensify as laughter filled the space, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the soft patter of rain that had begun to fall outside. A soft tension fell over the room, however, when the portrait hole swung open to reveal Percy Weasley, prefect badge gleaming on his chest. He surveyed the gathered students with his usual look of mild disapproval. "What's all this commotion about?" he asked, straightening his glasses. "I could hear you all the way down the corridor." "Just having some tea, Pers," Fred said innocently. "Care to join us?" Percy's eyes narrowed suspiciously. He knew his brothers well enough to sense mischief, but the sight before him— students gathered peacefully around the tea table seemed harmless enough. After a moment's hesitation, he approached the group. "I suppose I can do with a cup," he admitted, setting down his stack of books and reaching for the teapot. A hush fell over the common room as everyone watched Percy meticulously prepare his tea. 1 sugar, a small splash of milk, stirred precisely 3 times clockwise. The twins' eyes gleamed with anticipation as their older brother finally raised the cup to his lips. The teacup vanished. For a moment, Percy simply stared at his empty hand in stunned silence. Tea splashed onto his polished shoes, and a drop clung precariously to the end of his nose. The common room held its collective breath. Then, to everyone's immense surprise, a smile tugged at the corner of Percy's mouth. It was small at first, reluctant almost, but it grew steadily until he was actually chuckling, a sound so rare that several first years looked positively alarmed. "I should have known," Percy said, shaking his head as he wiped tea from his shoes with a flick of his wand. "Clever charm work, I must admit." Fred and George exchanged looks of delighted disbelief. Percy appreciating one of their pranks? It was almost too good to be true. The afternoon continued in this manner, with students coming and going, each taking their turn with the disappearing teacup. Some brought homework to the circle, content to study in the warmth of good company. Others simply relaxed in the comfortable chairs, watching the rain trace patterns on the windows and enjoying the peaceful chaos of the common room. As the sky outside deepened to a dusky purple, a new figure entered through the portrait hole. Professor McGonagall, head of Gryffindor House, stepped into the common room with her usual composed dignity. She often made brief visits in the evenings, checking in on her students and addressing any concerns that might have arisen during the day. The laughter died down as she approached, though a few muffled giggles could still be heard from the younger students. McGonagall's gaze swept across the gathered group, lingering for a moment on Fred and George, who managed to look almost angelic under her scrutiny. "Good evening, Professor," they chorused. "Mr. Weasley and Mr. Weasley," she nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "I see you've organized a tea party of sorts." "Just fostering inter-year unity, Professor," George said solemnly. "Would you care for a cup?" Fred offered, gesturing to the tea service. Several students bit their lips to keep from laughing outright. Surely the twins wouldn't dare prank Professor McGonagall. For a long moment, McGonagall simply looked at them, her eyes sharp behind her square spectacles. Then, with a small sigh that might have contained a hint of amusement, she said, "I suppose a brief cup wouldn't hurt." She settled into an armchair that a third year hastily vacated for her, smoothing her robes as she accepted the teacup that Fred handed her with exaggerated courtesy. The entire common room watched with bated breath as she raised it to her lips. Predictably, the cup vanished. What was less predictable was Professor McGonagall's reaction. Instead of the stern reprimand everyone expected, she merely raised one eyebrow as she looked at her empty hand. "I see," she said dryly. "Most amusing." Then, with a casual wave of her wand, she conjured a new teacup, this one tartan pale parted, and poured herself a fresh cup of tea, which she proceeded to drink without incident. A mixture of awe and renewed laughter rippled through the common room. The twins looked at their head of house with newfound respect. 10 points to Gryffindor for the impressive charm work, McGonagall announced, and then added with the faintest twitch of her lips, and 5 points from Gryffindor for disrupting afternoon study time. She stayed for about 15 minutes, asking after students' progress in their classes and reminding them of the upcoming Hogsmeade weekend. When she finally stood to leave, she paused by the twins' chairs. "I would suggest," she said quietly, "that the tea service return to normal by tomorrow morning. The house elves might be rather distressed otherwise." "Yes, Professor," they agreed, trying and failing to look contrite. As the portrait hole closed behind her, Ron Weasley shook his head in disbelief. "I can't believe you got away with that," he said to his brothers. "McGonagall actually gave you points." "The key to a good prank, little brother," Fred began, "is that everyone gets to be in on the joke, eventually," George finished. As evening settled fully over the castle, the common room gradually returned to its usual state. The enchanted teacup continued to cause delight whenever someone new attempted to use it, but the initial excitement had mellowed into a comfortable sociability. Students worked on assignments, played chess by the fire, or simply talked in low, content voices as the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows. The twins, pleased with the success of their modest prank, had moved on to scribbling notes for their next invention. Yet they paused occasionally to watch their fellow Gryffindors, quietly satisfied with how a simple disappearing teacup had transformed an ordinary afternoon into something memorable. Outside, the grounds of Hogwarts lay peaceful under the deepening night. The lake reflected the scattered lights from the castle windows, creating a mirror image of warmth and safety. Inside the stone walls, in common rooms and corridors, in the great hall and the library, similar scenes of everyday magic unfolded. Some grand, some small, all part of the intricate tapestry that made Hogwarts not just a school, but a home. In Gryffindor Tower, as the grandfather clock in the corner chimed the hour, someone suggested a round of exploding snap. Cushions were arranged on the floor, cards were dealt, and the warm circle of light from the fire embraced them all. Students of different years brought together by shared laughter and the simple joy of being exactly where they belonged. The enchanted teacup sat on the table, gleaming innocently in the firelight, occasionally vanishing and reappearing throughout the evening. Eventually, as promised, Fred or George would remove the charm. But not just yet. For now, it remained a small, gentle reminder that magic wasn't just about grand spells and complex incantations. Sometimes, it was found in the smallest moments. A disappearing teacup, a room full of laughter, the feeling of belonging that wrapped around them all like a comfortable blanket on a rainy evening. As the night grew later and students began to drift off to their dormitories, the common room slowly emptied. The fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, almost like a lullaby against the ancient stone. The last few Gryffindors lingered, reluctant to end such a pleasant evening. Among them were Fred and George, now sprawled in their favorite armchairs, watching the embers glow in the fireplace. "Not bad for an afternoon's work," Fred murmured sleepily. George nodded, his eyes half closed. Simple but effective. McGonagall's face, though, priceless. They fell into comfortable silence, listening to the rain and the occasional soft popping of the dying fire. The invisible teacup sat on the table between them, catching the last golden reflections of the flames. Tomorrow would bring new classes, new challenges, new ideas for mischief and magic. But for now, in this quiet moment between one day and the next, all was peaceful. Outside the windows of Gryffindor Tower, clouds parted to reveal a sky scattered with stars. The moon cast a silver glow over the sleeping castle and the forest beyond. Within those ancient walls, students dreamed of the day's adventures and tomorrow's possibilities, while the magic of Hogwarts continued its gentle watch over them all. The last embers in the common room fireplace glowed softly, then faded to darkness. The invisible teacup gleamed once more in the moonlight that now streamed through the windows, before settling into shadows for the night, waiting patiently for tomorrow's tea and laughter to begin again. In their dormitory beds later that night, the Weasley twins drifted off to sleep with matching smiles on their faces. Their day of gentle mischief had brought warmth and unity to Gryffindor Tower, proving once again that sometimes the simplest magic created the most wonderful moments. The castle settled around them, creaking and sighing as ancient buildings do. Suits of armor stood silent vigil in the corridors, portraits dozed in their frames, and somewhere in the kitchens, house elf prepared for tomorrow's breakfast. Hogwarts never truly slept, it simply breathed more slowly as night embraced its towers and turrets, its hidden passages and secret rooms. And in Gryffindor Tower, dreams of disappearing teacups, afternoon laughter, and the simple joy of being home filled the sleeping minds of students, carrying them gently through the night until morning light would once again stream through the windows, bringing with it new opportunities for magic, mischief, and memory-making in the halls of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The Weasley twins had always understood something fundamental about magic that many wizards and witches overlooked in their pursuit of the grand and spectacular. True magic resided in moments of connection. Their pranks, while sometimes elaborate, always served the deeper purpose of bringing people together, whether through shared laughter, collective bewilderment, or the simple pleasure of a mystery solved. The invisible teacup was a perfect example of this philosophy. It wasn't designed to embarrass or exclude. Rather, it created a ripple of inclusion that had spread throughout the common room, drawing in students from different years and even their strict head of house into a shared experience that would be remembered long after the charm was lifted. As the castle slept beneath the starry sky, this feeling of connection remained, hovering like a gentle spell over the towers and corridors. The magic of Hogwarts wasn't just in its moving staircases or enchanted ceilings. It lived in the relationships formed within its walls, in quiet evenings by the fire, in disappearing teacups and surprised laughter, in the knowledge that no matter how different each student might be, they all belonged to something greater than themselves. Morning would come, as it always did, bringing with it homework and classes and the ordinary challenges of learning magic. But for now, in the peaceful hours of night, the castle held its sleeping inhabitants in a gentle embrace, keeping them safe until dawn broke once more over the towers of Hogwarts, where even the smallest cup of tea could become an adventure worth remembering. The grounds around the castle lay quiet under the moonlight, the lake's surface occasionally rippled by the giant squid's lazy movements. In the forest, creatures of the night went about their business, some glancing toward the castle with ancient, knowing eyes. The whomping willow stood motionless, its branches still against the night sky. Even Hagrid's hut was dark, save for the faintest glow of embers in his fireplace, visible through a small window. Time passed differently at Hogwarts, slower somehow, as if magic itself wished to preserve these precious years of growth and discovery. Nights like these, filled with simple joys and gentle mischief, were threads in the tapestry of memories that would sustain students long after they had left these hallowed halls. For Fred and George Weasley, creators of the invisible teacup and orchestrators of countless other moments of magic and mirth, these were the days they would remember most fondly. Not just the grand pranks and spectacular escapades, but the quiet evenings when their magic brought smiles to tired faces and transformed an ordinary day into something special. And as the moon continued its journey across the star-scattered sky, Hogwarts slept on, its magic humming softly in ancient stones and enchanted objects, in moving staircases and talking portraits, in invisible teacups and the dreams of young witches and wizards who called this wondrous place their home. The night deepened, stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the universe magic continued its eternal dance, connecting all things great and small, from the grandest castle to the humblest teacup, weaving them together in a spell more powerful than any that could be taught in classrooms. The magic of belonging. In the peaceful dormitories of Gryffindor Tower, students slept soundly, their dreams filled with the day's simple joys, a vanishing teacup, shared laughter, the feeling of being exactly where they were meant to be. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, but for now, sleep embraced them all, carrying them gently through the night on soft wings of contentment. The invisible teacup sat on the table in the common room, occasionally catching a beam of moonlight that made it gleam momentarily before fading back into shadows. It would remain there until morning, a small reminder of the Weasley twins' special brand of magic, the kind that created not just laughter, but connection. Morning arrived with gentle persistence, sunlight streaming through the tower windows and touching the abandoned teacup with golden fingers. House elves moved silently through the common room, stoking the fire and tidying the scattered cushions from last night's impromptu gathering. One particularly small elf with large, bat-like ears approached the tea service with diligent purpose, reaching for the enchanted cup. The moment his long fingers closed around the handle, the cup vanished. The house elf squeaked in surprise, his tennis ball-sized eyes growing even wider as he patted the empty air where the cup had been. Then, with the wisdom of creatures who had seen countless magical oddities over centuries of service, he simply shook his head and continued with his duties, leaving the invisible teacup for its creators to handle. Students began to filter down from their dormitories, some bright-eyed and alert, others still yawning and rubbing sleep from their eyes. A few pointed and giggled at the teacup when it reappeared, clearly remembering yesterday's entertainment. The common room gradually filled with the comfortable sounds of morning, quiet conversations, the rustling of parchment as last-minute homework was completed, the soft thuds of heavy textbooks being packed into bags. Fred and George descended the spiral staircase together, their hair tousled from sleep, but their eyes already alert and scanning the room for reactions to their prank. They nodded with satisfaction upon seeing several students gesture toward the teacup as they explained yesterday's events to friends who had missed it. "Shall we?" Fred asked, pulling out his wand. George nodded, and together they approached the tea table. With synchronized flicks of their wands and a murmured countercharm, the enchantment was lifted. The teacup sat innocently on the table, now just an ordinary piece of porcelain once more. "Goodbye, old friend," George said, patting the cup gently. "You served us well. Perhaps we should retire it to the Wall of Fame," Fred suggested with a grin, referring to the small collection of prank memorabilia they kept hidden in their dormitory. "Nah," George replied after a moment's consideration. "Let it live on in its natural habitat. Every time someone has tea in here, they'll wonder." The twins glanced around the common room, noticing how yesterday's shared experience had subtly altered the atmosphere. Students who normally kept to their own year groups were mingling more freely. A seventh year was explaining a complex transfiguration concept to a struggling third year. Percy, surprisingly, was engaged in what appeared to be an almost friendly conversation with Lee Jordan. "Not bad for a simple vanishing charm," Fred murmured. "Sometimes the smaller spells make the biggest waves," George agreed. As they gathered their books for the day's classes, the twins were already whispering about their next magical mischief. Perhaps enchanted quills that wrote silly comments in the margins of notes, or cream puffs that changed the color of the eater's hair for an hour. The possibilities were endless in a place like Hogwarts, where magic seeped from the very stones, and creativity was limited only by imagination, and, occasionally, by Professor McGonagall's patience. But for now, they were content with the lingering effects of yesterday's success. The smiles exchanged between students as they passed the tea table, the sense of camaraderie that remained like a comfortable blanket over the Gryffindor common room. This was their true gift, not just the ability to create magical pranks, but to use those pranks to weave connections between people, turning strangers into friends and ordinary moments into memory. Outside the tower windows, the grounds of Hogwarts were coming alive with the day's activities. Hagrid could be seen crossing the lawn toward the greenhouses, a massive watering can in one hand. Owls circled the owlery before setting off with the morning mail. On the Quidditch pitch, the Hufflepuff team was already beginning their practice, yellow robes flashing in the early sunlight as they zoomed through training formations. The castle itself seemed to stretch in the morning light, its ancient stones warming gradually as the sun climbed higher. Suits of armor creaked as they adjusted their positions. Portraits yawned and greeted each other as they woke. In classrooms throughout the castle, professors prepared for the day's lessons, arranging magical instruments and checking cauldrons, reviewing textbooks and feeding the occasional magical creature kept for demonstration purposes. Yet despite all this activity, there remained a peaceful quality to the morning, a gentle transition from night to day, from dreams to wakefulness, from the magic of imagination to the magic of reality. In this in-between time, as students moved from the comfort of their dormitories to the challenges of the day ahead, there was a special kind of enchantment that couldn't be taught in any class or contained in any spellbook. It was the magic of ordinary moments made extraordinary through the simple act of sharing them. It was the magic of an invisible teacup that had, for one rainy afternoon, transformed a common room full of individuals into a community bound by laughter and wonder. And it was the magic that Fred and George Weasley understood better than most. The magic of connection that made Hogwarts not just a school, but a home. As they stepped through the portrait hole and into the corridor beyond, the twins carried this knowledge with them like a treasured secret. They might be known throughout the school as pranksters and troublemakers, but those who looked closer would see the true purpose behind their mischief, bringing light and laughter to even the most ordinary days, and reminding everyone that in a world of grand spells and powerful enchantments, sometimes the most magical thing of all was a moment of shared joy. The rest of the day would unfold as days at Hogwarts typically did, with lessons and assignments, triumphs and challenges, points earned and occasionally lost. But the memory of the invisible teacup would linger, a warm reminder that magic wasn't just something to be studied and mastered, it was something to be experienced and shared, a bridge between hearts and minds in a world that sometimes forgot the power of simple connection. And in the evening, when students returned to the Gryffindor common room tired from the day's learning, many would glance at the ordinary teacup sitting on the table by the fire and smile, remembering the laughter and camaraderie of the day before. Some might even pick it up cautiously, half expecting it to vanish once more, a testament to the lasting impact of the Weasley twins' special brand of magic that remained long after the spell itself had been lifted. For in the end, the true measure of a successful enchantment wasn't in its complexity or power, but in the memories it created and the connections it forged, invisible threads of belonging that, like the vanishing teacup, might not always be seen, but were always felt, weaving through the very fabric of life at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. And that, perhaps, was the greatest magic of all. Dawn crept softly over the Gryffindor boys' dormitory, painting the stone walls with gentle strokes of pale gold and rose. Outside, a light mist hung over the Hogwarts grounds, transforming the landscape into a dreamy watercolor of greens and blues. Inside the tower, the steady breathing of sleeping students mingled with the occasional snore or sleepy murmur. All was peaceful, serene, the perfect morning calm before the inevitable rush of a school day. In the bed nearest the window, George Weasley had been awake for nearly an hour already, his wand moving in practiced motions over a pile of freshly laundered socks that the house elves had delivered the previous evening. His twin brother Fred watched from his own bed, a look of sleepy amusement playing across his freckled face. "Are you sure about the incantation?" Fred whispered, careful not to wake their roommates. "Remember what happened when we tried to enchant those quills last month?" George grinned, not pausing in his wand work. "A completely different spell structure. This one's based on that singing get well card we sent Charlie after the Dragonburn incident. Besides, I've modified it." "That's what worries me," Fred replied, but his eyes sparkled with anticipation rather than concern. The plan was simple but brilliant, as their best ideas often were. Enchant the pile of clean socks to sing cheerful compliments whenever anyone picked them up. Imagine the surprise on their roommates' faces when they reached for their morning footwear, only to be serenaded with praise. It was harmless, unexpected, and, if executed correctly, would start the day with much-needed laughter. "Almost done," George murmured, his wand tracing a final complex pattern over the innocent-looking pile of laundry. Centiculum blandamentum. A faint shimmer rippled over the socks, so subtle it might have been a trick of the early morning light. Then the fabric settled, appearing completely ordinary once more. Fred raised an eyebrow. "Did it work?" "Only one way to find out," George replied, reaching for a maroon sock on top of the pile. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, to their delight, the sock began to vibrate slightly. But instead of the cheerful compliment they expected, a deep, resonant voice emerged from the wool, filled with unmistakable melancholy. "Alas," the sock intoned dramatically, "once again I am separated from my soul mate, destined to wander alone through the cruel world of feet and flaws. Will I ever know completion again, or am I doomed to eternal solitude?" Fred clapped a hand over his mouth to stifle his laughter. George stared at the sock in bewilderment, then glanced back at his wand, as if it had betrayed him. "That's not right," he whispered, but a grin was already spreading across his face. "That's not right at all. It's better," Fred declared, reaching for another sock. This one, a blue and white striped specimen, let out a theatrical sigh the moment Fred's fingers touched it. "To be or not to be worn," it proclaimed mournfully. "That is the question that haunts my every thread, whether 'tis nobler to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous toe jam, or to take arms against a sea of blisters." By now both twins were shaking with silent laughter. Whatever had gone wrong with the spell had produced something far more entertaining than their original concept. Instead of cheery compliments, they had created existentially distressed socks with a flair for the dramatic. "We should wake the others," Fred suggested, his eyes dancing with mischief. "This is too good to keep to ourselves." But there was no need. The socks' theatrical monologues had already roused Lee Jordan, who was sitting up in his bed, staring at them with sleepy confusion. "What in Merlin's name?" he began, but Fred tossed a sock his way before he could finish. The sock, a particularly garish orange one, landed in Lee's lap and immediately began to wail. "Oh, the indignity! Tossed about like a mere object, when I contain multitudes of feeling within my cotton soul. How little they understand of my complex inner life." Lee's confusion melted into delight as he realized what was happening. "You two are absolutely mental," he informed the twins, but he was already reaching for another sock to hear what it would say. Within minutes, the entire dormitory was awake, each boy grabbing socks and howling with laughter at the increasingly dramatic monologues. Some socks bemoaned their inevitable fate of developing holes. Others philosophized about the deeper meaning of being a left or a right in a binary sock world. One particularly passionate Argyle declared its unrequited love for a cashmere sweater it had met briefly in the laundry basket. "This is brilliant," Dean Thomas gasped, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes, as a striped sock in his hand delivered an impassioned speech about the oppression of being stuffed into shoes against its will. "Should we share the wealth?" George suggested, gathering an armful of the enchanted sock. Fred's eyes gleamed. "Absolutely. The girls' dormitory first." And so, as the morning sun rose higher over Hogwarts, the enchanted socks made their way throughout Gryffindor Tower. The girls' reaction was equally enthusiastic, with Ginny Weasley declaring it the twins' most inspired work yet, after listening to a pink sock recite what appeared to be sock-themed poetry of questionable quality. The common room gradually filled with students preparing for the day ahead, many of them clutching socks that continued to deliver melodramatic soliloquies. The atmosphere was one of shared amusement, with students passing particularly theatrical socks to one another and recounting the best lines they'd heard so far. "Mine compared itself to a lonely cloud," a third-year girl told her friends, who dissolved into giggles. "That's nothing," replied another. "Mine just gave a 3-minute speech about the existential dread of being paired with a sock of slightly different shade." Even the first years, who were sometimes intimidated by the older students, found themselves included in the fun as enchanted socks were shared freely among all years. The common room rang with laughter and theatrically deep voices proclaiming sock woes. Fred and George, surveying the scene from their favorite armchairs by the fire, exchanged satisfied glances. This was exactly the kind of harmless chaos they loved to create, something that brought people together through shared laughter, that transformed an ordinary morning into something memorable. Their contentment was briefly interrupted by the appearance of their younger brother Ron, who stumbled down the boys' staircase looking both amused and exasperated. "I can't find a single normal pair of socks," he complained, dropping into a chair beside them. "My left foot is currently being told it treads too heavily upon the delicate soul of sockdom." "Consider it character building," Fred suggested. "Besides, it's not wrong about your walking," George added. "You do stomp about like a troll with a stubbed toe." Ron rolled his eyes but couldn't maintain his annoyance in the face of the twins' evident delight. "How long does the charm last?" he asked instead. "No idea," George admitted cheerfully. "It was supposed to be a simple compliment charm, but something clearly got crossed with a drama enhancement spell. Could be an hour, could be a week. McGonagall will have kittens if these things start performing soliloquies in the middle of Transfiguration," Ron pointed out, though he didn't sound particularly concerned by the prospect. As if summoned by the mention of authority, Percy Weasley chose that moment to descend from the prefect's dormitory. He was already fully dressed in his school robes, prefect badge gleaming on his chest, but his feet were conspicuously bare. In one hand, he clutched a squirming black sock that appeared to be in the middle of a particularly passionate speech. "And so I say to you, is a sock not entitled to the sweat of its own fabric? Is a sock not worthy of dignity, of respect?" Percy stuffed the sock into his pocket, muffling but not entirely silencing its theatrical discourse. His expression as he approached his brothers was one of resigned disapproval. "I suppose you think this is amusing," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the common room full of laughing students and monologuing socks. "We do, actually," Fred confirmed. "Hilarious, in fact," George added. Percy sighed, adjusting his glasses in the way he always did when preparing to deliver a lecture. "It's incredibly unprofessional. Some of us have important responsibilities that don't include being distracted by footwear with an identity crisis." Rather than being chastened, the twins exchanged delighted glances. Percy's disapproval was practically a seal of approval for any prank. The more he disliked it, the more successful they considered it to be. "We could help you find a pair that matches your personality," Fred offered innocently. "I think I saw some particularly pompous argyles up in our dormitory." Percy opened his mouth to retort, but at that moment, the sock in his pocket delivered a particularly loud proclamation about the shackles of conformity, causing several nearby first years to dissolve into fits of giggles. A flush crept up Percy's neck, clashing magnificently with his red hair. "Just fix it," he muttered before stalking toward the portrait hole, the muffled oration of the sock in his pocket following him all the way out. "I don't think I've ever seen Percy without socks before," Ron observed, watching his older brother's retreating form with amusement. "This might be your most effective prank yet." The morning continued in this fashion, with students alternating between preparing for the day ahead and being entertained by the existential musings of their footwear. Some had embraced the chaos entirely, deliberately mismatching their socks to create philosophical debates between left and right feet. Others had wrapped their socks in scarves or stuffed them into gloves in half-hearted attempts to muffle the dramatic speeches, with limited success. As breakfast time approached, the Gryffindors made their way down to the Great Hall, many of them still carrying enchanted socks that continued to offer commentary on their journey. The long descent intoned a particularly gloomy grey sock in Neville Longbottom's hand. "Step by step we approach our inevitable doom. Oh, the cruel rhythm of existence, the steady march toward the abyss." "It's just breakfast, you know," Neville told it, but he was smiling nonetheless. The Great Hall was already filling with students from other houses, who looked up in confusion as the Gryffindor table became a chorus of deep, dramatic voices emanating from various pockets, bags, and, in some cases, actual feet. Curious Ravenclaws wandered over to investigate, while Hufflepuffs listened with delighted amusement. Even some Slytherins couldn't hide their interest, though they tried to maintain an air of disdain. "Weasleys?" Angelina Johnson asked Fred and George as they settled at the table, gesturing toward a Ravenclaw girl, who was listening in fascination to a sock's discourse on the futility of resistance against the wash cycle. "Who else?" Fred replied with a modest bow. Word spread quickly through the hall, and soon students from all houses were coming to the Gryffindor table to experience the talking socks for themselves. Some even traded their own ordinary socks for enchanted ones, eager to be part of the unusual phenomenon. "You should sell these," suggested a Hufflepuff fourth year after listening to a particularly poetic sock's musings on the changing seasons as metaphor for the cycle of laundry. Fred and George exchanged thoughtful glances. It wasn't a bad idea. With some refinement, perhaps options for different personalities, or the ability to customize the monologues, it could be quite the product. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes presents Soliloquy Socks, Fred murmured, testing the name. "For the foot that has something to say," George added with a grin. Their entrepreneurial musings were interrupted by the arrival of Professor McGonagall at the Gryffindor table. Her expression was one of practiced neutrality, but there was a tightness around her mouth that suggested she was working very hard to maintain it. "Mr. Weasley and Mr. Weasley," she said, somehow managing to address both twins simultaneously. "I've received reports of unusually vocal footwear in my house this morning." "Really, Professor?" George asked, wide-eyed with feigned innocence. "How extraordinary." "Indeed," McGonagall replied dryly. At that moment, as if on cue, a sock peeked out from a first year's pocket nearby and declared in ringing tones, "The darkness The darkness of drawer and shoe alike. Will I ever again see the light of day, or am I condemned to this cotton purgatory forevermore? McGonagall's lips twitched ever so slightly before she regained control. I trust that this theatrical outbreak will not find its way into my classroom during today's transfiguration lesson. We couldn't possibly predict the movements of independently minded socks, Professor, Fred said solemnly, but we'll do our best to encourage them to respect the sanctity of education, George promised, with equal gravity. McGonagall studied them for a long moment, then sighed. See that you do. And perhaps consider a career in magical theatre direction if your academic pursuits don't pan out. Your flair for the dramatic is notable. With that parting comment, which the twins chose to interpret as a compliment, she returned to the staff table, where Professor Flitwick was watching the proceedings with evident amusement. They even spotted Professor Dumbledore examining what appeared to be a particularly colourful sock that had made its way to the high table, his eyes twinkling behind his half-moon spectacles as it delivered what looked like an impassioned speech. I think we've outdone ourselves this time, Fred said, helping himself to toast and marmalade. Accidental brilliance is still brilliance, George agreed, pouring pumpkin juice for both of them. As breakfast continued, the enchanted socks showed no signs of losing their theatrical energy. If anything, they seemed to be adapting to their environment, commenting on the quality of the breakfast. Alas, these poor eggs, scrambled beyond recognition, much like my own confused existence. And the upcoming classes. Potions. The very word sends shivers through my delicate fibers. The Slytherin table, initially disdainful of the Gryffindor antics, gradually succumbed to curiosity. Even Draco Malfoy was spotted listening with reluctant amusement to a sock that was comparing the Great Hall's enchanted ceiling to the vast, uncaring heavens, under which all socks must eventually disintegrate. When it was finally time to head to the first classes of the day, students gathered their books and bags, many of them deliberately bringing along enchanted socks for continued entertainment. The twins had created something of a phenomenon, a small, silly enchantment that had somehow managed to unite the school, if only for a morning, in shared laughter and appreciation for the absurd. As they made their way to Charms, surrounded by the ongoing monologues of their creation, Fred nudged his twin. Not bad for a spell gone wrong. Gone wrong? George repeated with a grin. I'd say it went exactly right, just not in the way we expected. And perhaps that was the true magic of the Weasley twins. Not just their skill with spells or their creativity, but their ability to find joy in the unexpected, to embrace chaos and transform mistakes into moments of wonder. In a school dedicated to teaching control and precision in magic, they were a constant reminder that sometimes the best enchantments were the ones that surprised even their casters. Throughout the day, the Talking Socks continued their theatrical performances, though with gradually decreasing frequency. By lunchtime, many had reduced their monologues to occasional sighs or brief philosophical observations. By dinner, most were merely muttering softly to themselves, like actors rehearsing lines backstage. But the effect of their brief stardom lingered. Students who had never spoken to each other before found themselves bonding over shared sock anecdotes. Professors who had initially been annoyed found themselves recounting particularly amusing sock soliloquies in the staff room. Even Percy, though he would never admit it, was overheard repeating one of the more poetic sock declarations to a fellow prefect, who dissolved into surprised laughter. As evening settled over Hogwarts and students returned to their common rooms for the night, the enchantment finally began to fade completely. Socks returned to their natural state of silent functionality, though perhaps with an added air of having experienced something profound. The laundry baskets of Hogwarts had never been quite so full of well-travelled, story-rich footwear. In the Gryffindor common room, Fred and George sat by the fire, surrounded by friends still recounting their favourite moments from the day. Lee Jordan was doing an impressive impression of a particularly melancholy sock he'd encountered in herbology, while Angelina Johnson argued that the one she'd heard in the library had been even more dramatic. We should do a sequel, Fred murmured to his twin. Emotional underpants, perhaps. Philosophical pajamas, George countered. Existential sweater. Melodramatic mittens. They grinned at each other, already mentally cataloguing the spells they would need to research, the modifications they would make to avoid detection next time, the potential for turning these enchantments into products for their future joke shop. But for now, they were content to bask in the success of the day, in the laughter that still rippled through the common room, in the knowledge that they had once again transformed an ordinary day at Hogwarts into something extraordinary, not through grand gestures or complicated magic, but through the simple act of bringing unexpected life to the mundane. Outside the windows of Gryffindor Tower, stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the evening sky. The grounds of Hogwarts were quiet, peaceful in the gathering darkness. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the comfortable murmur of conversation created a cocoon of contentment around the students. As curfew approached and younger students began to drift toward their dormitories, still smiling over the day's events, Fred and George exchanged a look of satisfaction. This was why they did what they did, not just for the chaos or the challenge, but for moments like these, when their magic brought people together and created memories that would last long after the enchantment itself had faded. Good day's work, Fred said quietly. The best kind, George agreed. And as night settled fully over Hogwarts Castle, wrapping it in a blanket of stars and silence, the last of the enchanted socks delivered their final lines, soft whispers of drama and philosophy that guided their wearers gently toward dreams. Tomorrow would bring new classes, new challenges, perhaps even new mischief. But for now, in this peaceful moment between one day and the next, all was well. The legacy of the talking socks lived on long after the enchantment had faded. For weeks afterward, students would occasionally hold up a sock and mimic the dramatic monologues they had heard, sending their friends into fits of laughter. Some creative individuals in Ravenclaw even started a sock theatre club, where they wrote and performed original plays from the perspective of enchanted clothing. At breakfast one morning, about a week after the incident, Fred and George received a small package delivered by a school owl. Inside was a pair of brand new socks, one maroon, one gold, and a note written in neat, precise handwriting. For creating laughter in unexpected places, do try to aim your creativity toward less disruptive targets in the future. MM. The twins exchanged grins over Professor McGonagall's unexpected gift. They knew she would never admit it publicly, but it seemed their head of house had appreciated their magical mischief, after all. We should frame these, Fred suggested, holding up the socks. Or enchant them to sing her praises whenever she walks by, George countered with a mischievous glint in his eye. Maybe next term, Fred agreed. I think we've fulfilled our sock mischief quota for now. As winter settled more firmly over the castle, bringing shorter days and longer nights, the Weasley twins turned their creative energies to new projects. There were always more spells to discover, more products to develop, more moments of magic to create in the everyday life of Hogwarts. But the talking socks had secured their place in the unofficial history of Weasley pranks. Not the most elaborate or impressive, perhaps, but certainly one of the most universally enjoyed. It had been a reminder that sometimes the simplest magic could create the most joy, that finding wonder in the ordinary was its own kind of enchantment. And in the dormitories of Hogwarts, where students now checked their socks each morning with a hint of hopeful anticipation, the memory of that day when footwear found its voice remained a bright spot of warmth against the growing winter chill. The snow began to fall outside the windows of Gryffindor Tower, soft flakes drifting down from a pearl-grey sky. Inside, the fire burned merrily in the grate, and students gathered around it with books and games, with stories and laughter, with the simple pleasure of being together in a place where even the most ordinary objects might, with a touch of magic and mischief, become something extraordinary. For that was the true gift of the Weasley twins to Hogwarts, not just their pranks or their products, but their ability to see the potential for wonder in everything around them, and their generosity in sharing that vision with everyone else. In a school dedicated to teaching the grand and powerful aspects of magic, they were a constant reminder that sometimes the most magical moments of all were the ones that simply made you smile. As the winter days grew shorter and the nights longer, as the castle settled under a blanket of snow and starlight, the legend of the talking socks became just another thread in the rich tapestry of stories that made Hogwarts more than a school. It became a place of endless possibility, where every day held the potential for a new adventure, and where even the smallest, most ordinary objects might be waiting to reveal their extraordinary magic. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest enchantment of all. The ability to find wonder not in grand spells or powerful potions, but in something as simple as a sock, with a flair for the dramatic and a philosophical view of life. Months later, as spring began to unfurl across the Hogwarts grounds, melting the last patches of snow and coaxing new green buds from the earth, memories of the talking socks still brought smiles to faces throughout the castle. The story had become part of that year's folklore, passed down to new students who hadn't witnessed it firsthand, embellished slightly with each retelling, until the socks had supposedly delivered Shakespearean soliloquies and debated the finer points of magical theory with Professor Flitwick. In the Gryffindor dormitories, some students still checked their socks each morning, just in case the enchantment might spontaneously return. Others had taken to writing little messages inside their socks, quotes or jokes or encouragements, as a way of keeping the spirit of that day alive. Even Percy, though he would never admit it, had been spotted examining a particularly formal pair of dress socks with a hint of wistful expectation before a ministry visit. For Fred and George, the talking socks had become a touchstone in their development as magical mischief makers. The accidental brilliance of that enchantment had taught them that sometimes the best magic came not from rigid planning, but from allowing spells room to evolve in unexpected ways. "We should try more accidental magic," Fred suggested one evening as they worked on new product ideas in their favorite corner of the common room. "See what happens when we deliberately muddle enchantments together." George nodded thoughtfully, his quill hovering over a piece of parchment where he'd been sketching designs for what they were now officially calling soliloquy socks for their future joke shop. "Calculated chaos," he agreed. "Let magic find its own path sometimes." This philosophy would guide many of their future inventions, the willingness to embrace unexpected outcomes, to find opportunity in accidents, to see failure not as the end, but as a doorway to something potentially better than what they'd originally envisioned. It was a lesson that extended beyond their magical pranks. In a world that often valued meticulous planning and predictable results, The Weasley twins were a reminder that sometimes the most magical moments came from letting go of control and embracing the beautiful chaos of possibility. As spring deepened into summer and the school year began to wind toward its close, the twins continued their creative experiments. Some succeeded brilliantly, others failed spectacularly, but they approached each attempt with the same spirit of playful curiosity, knowing that even in failure there might be a seed of something wonderful. Just as a spell gone wrong had once given voice to a dormitory full of socks and, in doing so, had brought moments of unexpected joy to an entire school. And when they packed their trunks at the end of term, preparing to return to the burrow for the summer holidays, each twin carefully tucked away a single enchanted sock, now silent, but still holding the memory of that magical day. These were their talismans, their reminders of what was possible when you approached magic not just with skill and power, but with imagination and joy. The socks had long since lost their ability to speak, but in a way they had never truly fallen silent. Their legacy lived on in the laughter they had inspired, in the connections they had forged, in the reminder they had provided that magic wasn't just about grand gestures and powerful spells. It was about finding wonder in the ordinary, about transforming the mundane into the extraordinary, about creating moments of shared joy in a world that sometimes forgot the power of simple pleasures. And so, as the Hogwarts Express carried students home for the summer, as the castle settled into its temporary quietude, as the grounds basked in the golden warmth of June, the legend of the talking socks found its place in the vast collection of stories that made up the history of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. A small tale, perhaps, compared to the grand narratives of founders and headmasters, of historic tournaments and ancient artifacts, but no less magical for its simplicity. For in the end, what was magic if not the ability to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary? What was wonder if not finding the remarkable hidden within the everyday? And what was joy if not the shared experience of discovering that even the smallest, most common objects, like a simple pair of socks, could, with a touch of imagination and a sprinkle of mischief, become something magical? As summer bloomed over Hogwarts and stars wheeled peacefully above its sleeping towers, these questions lingered in the warm night air, not demanding answers, but offering possibilities, inviting dreams, suggesting that perhaps the most powerful magic of all was the kind that lived not in spell books or wands, but in the ability to see the world as a place of endless wonder, where every object held potential, every moment offered opportunity, and every ordinary day might, with the right perspective, become extraordinary. Night had settled over Hogwarts like a velvet cloak, stars scattered across the inky sky like diamond dust. The castle stood in silhouette against this celestial backdrop, its towers reaching toward the heavens as if trying to touch the moon itself. Most windows had gone dark hours ago as students surrendered to sleep, dreams of spells and potions carrying them gently through the night. But in Gryffindor Tower, one window still glowed with soft golden light, a beacon of wakefulness in the sleeping castle. Inside the common room, the fire had burned down to embers that pulsed with gentle warmth, casting long shadows that danced across the worn carpets and comfortable furniture. It was in this peaceful hour, when the boundary between one day and the next grew thin, that Fred Weasley slipped through the portrait hole and back into the common room, his robes bulging suspiciously and his freckled face alight with mischievous anticipation. George looked up from his position by the fire, where he'd been keeping watch with Lee Jordan and a handful of other night owls who had elected to stay up past curfew on this particular Friday evening. The common room was sparsely populated, just enough students to make whatever Fred had planned worthwhile, but not so many that they risked drawing attention from patrolling prefects or professors. Success? George asked quietly as his twin approached. Fred's grin widened as he carefully patted his bulging pockets. Better than we hoped, he whispered back. The house elves were particularly helpful tonight. Seemed quite excited about the project, actually. Well, don't keep us in suspense, Lee urged, leaning forward in his armchair. What have you got? Instead of answering, Fred reached into his robes and withdrew a small cloth bag that clinked softly with the sound of glass against glass. He set it gently on the table between them and began to untie the drawstring with deliberate care, as if handling something precious and potentially volatile. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced in a hushed, theatrical tone, prepare yourselves for a midnight miracle of magical munchables. From inside the bag, Fred produced several small glass jars, each filled with what appeared to be ordinary marshmallows. But even in the dim light of the common room, there was something unusual about them. They seemed to pulse with a faint inner light, like tiny clouds at sunset. Enchanted marshmallows, Fred explained, unscrewing the lid of the first jar. A Weasley specialty with a little help from our friends in the kitchen. The moment the lid was removed, something extraordinary happened. A single marshmallow rose from the jar, floating gently upward until it hovered at eye level. It glowed with a soft, pearl-like luminescence, casting just enough light to illuminate Fred's delighted expression. Then, with a gesture from his wand and a whispered word, the marshmallow drifted lazily through the air toward Lee. Open wide, Fred instructed. Lee obligingly opened his mouth, and the marshmallow floated directly between his lips, then disappeared with a soft, musical pop sound. Lee's eyes widened in surprise and pleasure. Tastes like summer, he said wonderingly. Like sunshine and picnics, and... Is that a hint of butterbeer? Each one's different, George explained, watching as Fred released more marshmallows from their glass prisons. That's the beauty of them. They adapt to whatever flavor brings you the most comfort. Soon, a dozen glowing marshmallows were drifting through the common room like fluffy, edible fireflies. They moved with gentle purpose, occasionally bobbing or weaving, but generally maintaining a peaceful, almost hypnotic float. The soft light they cast transformed the familiar space into something magical. Corners that had been dark were now illuminated with a warm, gentle glow that felt like captured moonlight. Word spread quickly, as it always did in Hogwarts when something interesting was happening. Students who had been preparing for bed came back downstairs, wrapped in dressing gowns and curiosity. Others emerged from hidden corners of the common room where they'd been studying or talking quietly. All were drawn to the gentle light and the promise of unexpected magic. Ginny Weasley appeared at the bottom of the girls' staircase, her red hair tumbling over her shoulders as she rubbed sleep from her eyes. "What's going on?" she asked, and then stopped short at the sight of the floating marshmallows. A nearby marshmallow seemed to notice her arrival. It changed course and drifted toward her, its glow brightening slightly as if in greeting. Ginny watched it approach with a mixture of surprise and delight, then smiled as it popped gently into her mouth. "Moon," she sighed, closing her eyes in appreciation. "Tastes like Mum's treacle tart." More students joined the impromptu gathering, each experiencing their own moment of wonder as marshmallows found their way to them. Some tried to catch the floating treats in their hands, only to find that they would hover just out of reach until the right moment, then pop directly into eager mouths. Others simply stood still, waiting patiently for their turn, smiling as the marshmallows danced around them in lazy circles before making their delicious delivery. Neville Longbottom was particularly enchanted, watching the glowing confections with wide-eyed wonder. When one finally approached him, hovering patiently before his face, he hesitated. "Go on, Neville," Fred encouraged. "It won't bite. Can't actually. No teeth." Neville cautiously opened his mouth, and the marshmallow disappeared with a musical pop. His expression transformed from uncertainty to pure joy. "Grandmother's spiced pumpkin cookies," he said, with a hint of amazement in his voice. "How did you know?" "We didn't," George explained, watching as more marshmallows escaped their jars to join the gentle ballet of light and sweetness. "That's the magic. They know what you need most right now." As the common room filled with more students, Fred released more marshmallows to accommodate them all. Soon, dozens of the glowing treats were floating through the air, creating patterns of light that reflected off the ancient stone walls and cast the room in a dreamlike glow. The atmosphere had transformed completely from the sleepy, dying embers quiet of late evening to something that felt both magical and intimate. A shared secret, a communal moment of wonder. Someone had the inspired idea to prepare hot chocolate to accompany the magical marshmallows. Soon, the rich aroma of melted chocolate filled the air, mingling with the subtle sweetness of the floating treats. Mugs were passed around, and students discovered a new delight when the glowing marshmallows popped into hot chocolate. Instead of directly into mouths, they created tiny, momentary fireworks of light that danced across the surface of the drink before dissolving into additional flavor. Hermione Granger, who had initially watched the proceedings with her usual mixture of curiosity and mild disapproval, being well aware that Fred must have been out after curfew to visit the kitchens, found herself drawn in despite her better judgment. She sat cross-legged on a cushion near the fire, a book still open in her lap but largely forgotten as she watched the marshmallows float by. Her cat Crookshanks was even more fascinated. The large ginger feline had taken up a strategic position on the back of an armchair, his bushy tail twitching as his amber eyes tracked the movement of the glowing treats. Occasionally, he would make a half-hearted swipe at a passing marshmallow, but they always drifted just out of reach of his paws, as if they knew they weren't meant for feline consumption. "I'd be careful if I were you," Ron told the cat, watching Crookshank's hunting posture with amusement. "You might not like what you catch. Mine tasted like bacon, but yours might taste like," he shrugged, "I dunno, mice or something." Crookshanks ignored him completely, continuing his silent vigil. Then, with a sudden burst of determination, he launched himself from the armchair in a graceful arc, paws extended toward a particularly bright marshmallow that had been bobbing near the ceiling. The common room held its collective breath, as cat and confection seemed destined to meet, but at the last possible moment, the marshmallow darted sideways, leaving Crookshanks to land with considerably less grace than he had jumped, skidding slightly on a table before regaining his dignity and pretending that he had meant to do exactly that. Laughter rippled through the gathering, not mocking, but the warm kind of shared amusement that draws people together rather than pushing them apart. Even Hermione smiled, reaching out to scratch her cat's ears consolingly as he returned to his perch, slightly rumpled but still determined. "How long do they last?" someone asked Fred, watching as new marshmallows continued to emerge from the jars, replacing those that had been eaten. "As long as there's wonder left in the room," Fred replied with a theatrical wink. "So probably till dawn, given this crowd." He wasn't wrong. As the night deepened toward midnight, the common room settled into a gentle rhythm of conversation, laughter, and peaceful enjoyment. Students who might normally pass each other with barely a nod found themselves engaged in conversations, drawn together by the shared experience of the magical marshmallows. A group of first years, who had been too shy to join the gathering initially, were now seated in a circle near one of the windows, taking turns describing the flavors they tasted and guessing what each other's marshmallows might have been. Older students told stories of their first experiences with magical foods, of family traditions involving enchanted treats, of memorable feasts and celebrations. Katie Bell had brought out her wizarding wireless, tuning it to a station that played soft, instrumental music that seemed to complement the gentle dance of the glowing marshmallows. Some students had wrapped themselves in blankets against the late-night chill, creating cozy nests in armchairs and on cushions scattered across the floor. Outside, the moon had risen high above the castle, its silver light streaming through the windows to mingle with the pearl-like glow of the marshmallows. The effect was mesmerizing. Moonbeams and magic weaving together to create an atmosphere of peaceful enchantment that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time. Fred and George, watching their creation unfold around them, exchanged looks of quiet satisfaction. This was different from their usual pranks and mischief. Gentler, more intimate, but no less magical for its subtlety. It was mischief as nurturing, as comfort, as connection. Not bad for a midnight snack run, George murmured to his twin. Sometimes the simplest spells create the best magic, Fred agreed, accepting a mug of hot chocolate from a passing second year with a nod of thanks. As midnight approached, the portrait hole swung open once more, revealing a very sleepy-looking Neville, who had apparently stepped out briefly and was now returning. He was followed closely by Professor McGonagall, whose tartan dressing gown and stern expression suggested that she had been roused from bed to deal with whatever was keeping her Gryffindors awake at this hour. A hush fell over the common room as she stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the gathered students and the glowing marshmallows that continued their peaceful dance through the air. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, to everyone's surprise, a particularly bold marshmallow detached itself from the general swarm and floated directly towards McGonagall, hovering before her with what could only be described as an air of hopeful offering. The professor regarded it with raised eyebrows, then glanced toward Fred and George, who were trying very hard to look innocent and mostly failing. "I suppose," she said dryly, "that this explains the unusual amount of light coming from Gryffindor Tower at an hour when all sensible students should be asleep." "Just a bit of Friday night relaxation, Professor," Fred offered. "Educational, really," George added. "Practical application of hover charms and flavor-enhancing spells. Nutritional benefits," Fred concluded with a solemn nod. McGonagall's lips tightened, but there was a suspicious twitch at one corner of her mouth that suggested she was suppressing a smile. The marshmallow continued to bob hopefully before her, its glow brightening slightly as if trying to win her over. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, McGonagall sighed. "I suppose," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, "that since it's the weekend, and since you've all managed to keep the noise to a reasonable level." She didn't finish the sentence, but instead, to the astonishment of every student present, she opened her mouth slightly. The marshmallow didn't hesitate, popping in with a musical chime that seemed somehow more respectful than the others had been. A look of surprise crossed McGonagall's features, followed by something that might almost have been pleasure. She composed herself quickly, but not before several students had exchanged wide-eyed glances of disbelief. "Ginger newts," she murmured, almost to herself. Then, more loudly, "Very well, you may continue your evening activities, but I expect lights out by 1 o'clock and no exceptions." With that, she turned to leave, her tartan dressing gown swishing around her ankles. At the portrait hole, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. "And Mr. Weasley," she added, not specifying which twin she meant, though somehow they both knew. 5 points to Gryffindor for impressive charm work, though next time, perhaps consider enchanting something less likely to leave sticky residue on the ceiling. With that parting comment, she was gone, leaving behind a common room full of students who weren't sure whether to be relieved or amazed that they'd witnessed their strict head of house accepting a magical marshmallow without taking points or assigning detention. "Did that just happen?" Ron asked, no one in particular, his voice tinged with awe. "Apparently McGonagall has a sweet tooth," Fred replied with a grin. "File that away for future reference, Georgie." "Already noted," his twin assured him. The unexpected visit from their professor might have dampened the mood in the common room, but instead it seemed to add an extra layer of specialness to the night. There was something magical about sharing this moment, not just with fellow students, but with Hogwarts itself, as if the castle and its guardians were acknowledging the value of these small moments of wonder and connection. As midnight struck, marked by the distant chiming of the clock tower, the marshmallows seemed to respond to the hour. Their glow intensified slightly, and they began to move with more purpose, creating patterns in the air, spirals and figure eights, concentric circles and gentle waves. It was like watching a choreographed dance or a silent fireworks display, beautiful in its quiet elegance. Students who had been thinking of heading to bed decided to stay a little longer, drawn in by this new development. Those who had been talking fell silent, watching the display with expressions of rapt attention. Even Crookshanks paused in his marshmallow hunting endeavors, his amber eyes reflecting the dancing lights. "Did you plan this part?" Lee asked Fred and George in a hushed voice, unwilling to break the spell of the moment. The twins exchanged glances. "Happy accident," Fred admitted. "But the best magic often is." The marshmallow light show continued for several minutes, building in complexity and beauty, until the common room was filled with swirling patterns of gentle radiance. Then, slowly, the movements began to calm, returning to the peaceful bob and drift of earlier in the evening. It was as if the marshmallows had offered a special midnight performance and were now returning to their regular enchantment. Conversations resumed, but quieter now, more intimate. The atmosphere had shifted from the excited sociability of earlier to something more reflective, more peaceful. Some students, particularly the younger ones, began to drift toward their dormitories, yawning but smiling, carrying the memory of magic and marshmallows with them toward dreams. Others lingered, reluctant to end such a special evening. They spoke in hushed voices about classes and Quidditch, about hopes and worries, about the small moments of magic that made life at Hogwarts unlike anywhere else in the world. The floating marshes continued to offer their sweet comfort, popping into mouths or hot chocolate at just the right moments, as if they could sense when someone needed a little extra bit of joy. In one corner, Hermione had finally set aside her book entirely and was engaged in a surprisingly civil conversation with Ron about the theoretical underpinnings of the marshmallow enchantment. Nearby, Neville was showing a first year how to cup his hands around his hot chocolate to keep it warm, smiling shyly as the younger boy looked at him with unmistakable admiration. Ginny had fallen asleep in an armchair, a blanket tucked around her shoulders and a peaceful smile on her face. A particularly gentle marshmallow hovered near her, its glow dimmed to a soft nightlight that kept the shadows at bay. Fred and George, watching it all unfold from their position by the fire, felt a rare moment of contentment that had nothing to do with successful pranks or clever jokes. This was different, a kind of magic that didn't rely on surprise or disruption, but on comfort and connection. "We should do this more often," George said quietly, watching as a marshmallow drifted by, leaving a trail of soft light in its wake. "The peaceful stuff, you mean?" Fred asked. "Not sure it's our brand exactly," George shrugged. "Maybe our brand is bigger than we thought. Maybe it's not just about the chaos." Fred considered this, his eyes tracking the gentle movement of the marshmallows as they continued their peaceful journey through the common room. "Maybe," he conceded. "Chaos gets attention, but this gets something else." Neither twin had the words to fully express what that something else might be, but they didn't need to. They could see it in the faces around them, in the relaxed smiles, the comfortable postures, the way students who might normally hurry past each other were now sharing blankets and stories and moments of quiet wonder. It was connection, pure and simple. It was the magic that happened when people paused long enough to share an experience, to be present in a moment of beauty or wonder or simple pleasure. It was the kind of enchantment that couldn't be taught in classes or learned from books, but that transformed a castle into a home, and a collection of students into a family. As the night deepened toward 1 o'clock, more students began to drift off to bed, carrying with them the warm memory of floating marshmallows and shared magic. Some took final marshmallows with them, the glowing treats following them up the spiral staircases like gentle guides toward dreams. Eventually, only a handful remained in the common room. The twins, Lee, Hermione, who had finally succumbed to the late hour and was dozing in her chair, Crookshanks purring in her lap, and a few seventh years who were quietly discussing their plans for after graduation. The fire had burned down to its lowest embers, casting just enough warmth to keep the chill at bay. Outside the windows, the moon had begun its descent toward the horizon, and the stars seemed to shine even brighter in the velvety darkness of the late-night sky. Just before 1 o'clock, as if by mutual understanding, the last students began to gather their things and prepare for bed. The remaining marshmallows, now just a dozen or so, drifted into a loose circle above the center of the room, their glow softening to a gentle pulse that matched the rhythm of peaceful breathing. Fred carefully collected the now empty glass jars and tucked them back into his bag. "Successful experiment, I'd say," he murmured to George, as they watched the last marshmallows begin to fade, their light dimming as the magic that sustained them gradually dispersed. "More than success," George agreed, "though we should probably destroy the evidence before morning. Can you imagine if Snape heard about this? He'd have us in detention till we're as old as Dumbledore." Fred chuckled softly. "Worth it, though." As they climbed the staircase to their dormitory, leaving behind a common room now peaceful in darkness, they carried with them not just the memory of a successful bit of magic, but the deeper satisfaction of having created something that brought genuine joy to others. It wasn't their usual brand of mischief, perhaps, but it had its own kind of magic, gentler, quieter, but no less powerful for its subtlety. In the dormitory, as they prepared for bed, Fred noticed something unexpected on his pillow. A single marshmallow, glowing with a soft, pearl-like light. It hadn't been there when he'd left earlier in the evening, and by all rights the enchantment should have faded by now, along with all the others. Yet there it was, hovering just above his pillow, as if waiting for him. He glanced over at George's bed and saw that his twin had discovered a similar surprise. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the darkened room, sharing a silent understanding that went beyond words. Then, with synchronized movements born of a lifetime of being in perfect step with each other, they each reached out and accepted the final gift of the evening. The marshmallows popped into their mouths with twin musical chimes, bringing with them a taste that was both familiar and surprising. "Home," George whispered into the darkness. "Tastes like home." Fred nodded, though his brother couldn't see it. "The burrow in summer," he agreed. "Mum's kitchen on Sunday morning." They fell silent then, sinking into their beds as the last of the magic washed over them. Outside, the moon continued its journey across the star-scattered sky. Inside, the ancient castle creaked and settled, wrapping its sleeping inhabitants in stone and magic and centuries of memories. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, perhaps even new mischief. But for now, in this peaceful moment between one day and the next, the twins drifted toward dreams filled with the gentle glow of floating marshmallows and the quiet magic of connection. As dawn approached and the first hints of light began to touch the eastern horizon, a solitary marshmallow, the very last of the enchanted treats, floated gently through the common room. It paused by each empty mug, each abandoned blanket, each cushion that still bore the impression of someone who had sat there hours before. It was as if the marshmallow was saying goodbye to the night's magic, acknowledging the temporary community that had formed in this room and then dispersed to dreams. Its glow was faint now, barely visible in the gradually lightening room, but it moved with purpose, completing one final circuit before coming to rest on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. There, as the first rays of morning sun streamed through the windows, the marshmallow's light faded completely, leaving behind nothing but a small, ordinary treat that would likely be discovered by an early riser and enjoyed without any knowledge of its magical past. But the memory of that night, the floating lights, the unexpected flavors, the shared laughter and quiet conversations would linger in the minds of all who had been there. It would become part of the intricate tapestry of memories that made Hogwarts more than just a school. It would be one of those moments that students would remember years later when they thought back on their time at the castle. They might forget specific spells or potion ingredients. They might mix up historical dates or transfiguration theories, but they would remember the night when the common room glowed with floating marshmallows, when Professor McGonagall herself had participated in their midnight feast, when Crookshanks had launched himself after a bobbing treat and missed spectacularly. They would remember the feeling of being part of something magical that had nothing to do with lessons or homework or house points, but was simply about the joy of shared experience and the wonder of unexpected enchantment in ordinary things. And perhaps in years to come, some of them would create similar moments of magic for others, not necessarily with floating marshmallows or talking socks or invisible teacups, but with whatever tools they had at hand. They would remember the lesson that Fred and George Weasley had taught them without ever meaning to, that sometimes the simplest magic created the most profound connections, and that mischief, at its heart, could be an act of love. As the sun rose fully over Hogwarts, casting long golden shadows across the grounds and warming the ancient stones, the castle began to stir with the first activities of morning. House elves moved silently through corridors, preparing for the day ahead. Portraits yawned and greeted each other, exchanging news and gossip. In the great hall, tables began to fill with breakfast foods in anticipation of hungry students. And in Gryffindor Tower, as sunlight streamed through the windows of the common room, illuminating dust motes that danced like miniature enchanted marshmallows in the morning light. The last physical evidence of the previous night's magic was discovered by a hungry third year, who popped the ordinary-looking marshmallow into his mouth without a second thought. "Aha," he said to his friend as they headed down to breakfast. "Tasted like, I don't know, magic, sort of." His friend rolled his eyes, not understanding the accidental truth of the statement. But somewhere in the castle, the Weasley twins were already awake, already planning their next bit of magical mischief, already wondering how to once again transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. Not just for the sake of chaos or attention, but for those quieter, deeper moments of connection that were, in the end, the most magical of all. Rain fell in gentle sheets across the Hogwarts grounds, transforming the world outside into a watercolor painting of greys and muted greens. The lake rippled with countless tiny circles as raindrops met its surface, and the mountains in the distance were veiled in low-hanging clouds that seemed to embrace the castle in a soft cocoon of mist. Inside, students pressed their noses against window panes, sighing at the weather that had confined them indoors for the third consecutive day. The great hall's enchanted ceiling reflected the somber sky above, though the floating candles that hovered between the ancient beams did their best to add warmth to the gloomy atmosphere. At the Gryffindor table, Fred and George Weasley sat with their heads close together, their voices low and their expressions suspiciously innocent as they occasionally glanced around the hall with the calculated casualness of those planning something delightfully disruptive. "Are you sure about this one?" George murmured, absently stirring his porridge as his eyes tracked Professor Flitwick, who was making his way along the Ravenclaw table with a stack of parchments. Fred nodded, his freckled face alight with anticipation. "Tested it last night on my own chair in the dormitory. Floated for a good 10 minutes before the charm wore off. No side effects. Totally controllable. And the trigger? Simple sitting motion. The moment someone's full weight is on the chair, whoosh." Fred made an upward gesture with his hand, mimicking gentle levitation. George grinned, the expression mirroring his twins exactly. "Perfect for a day like this. Everyone could use a bit of lifting up, don't you think?" They were right about that. The persistent rain had cast a pall over the entire castle, dampening spirits as effectively as it dampened the grounds. Classes continued, of course. Magical education waited for no weather, but there was a distinct lack of energy in the corridors between lessons. Even the ghosts seemed more transparent than usual, as if the general gloom had affected their ability to maintain a proper haunting presence. The twins finished their breakfast quickly, eager to set their plan in motion before the hall emptied for morning classes. With carefully timed movements, they rose from the table and began a casual circuit of the room, pausing to chat with friends, to ask about homework, to comment on the weather, all while their wands, concealed in the sleeves of their robes, performed subtle, intricate motions beneath the cover of ordinary gestures. "Levi Corpus Cecilia," Fred whispered as he passed behind a particularly comfortable-looking chair at the Hufflepuff table, his wand flicking minutely toward its wooden frame. A faint shimmer, barely perceptible in the candle-lit hall, rippled across the chair's surface. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed. It was still just a chair, waiting for someone to claim it. But Fred knew better, and the wink he exchanged with George as they continued their circuit confirmed that the first stage of their plan was successfully underway. By the time they had completed their lap of the Great Hall, no fewer than 15 chairs had been enchanted. A careful selection spread across all 4 house tables, plus a particularly plush one at the staff table, that the twins rather hoped would be claimed by Professor Flitwick, whose naturally buoyant personality seemed perfect for their floating charm. Now all they had to do was wait. They didn't have to wait long. As breakfast wound to a close and students began gathering their things for the day ahead, the first unsuspecting target approached one of the enchanted chairs. It was a fifth-year Ravenclaw girl, her arms full of books, and her mind clearly occupied with the day's lessons, rather than the possibility of magical mischief lurking in her chosen seat. She sat down with the distracted air of someone mentally reviewing transfiguration theory, reached for her teacup, and gently, almost imperceptibly, began to rise. It was so gradual that at first neither she nor the students around her noticed. 1 inch, 2 inches, 3. By the time she had risen a foot off the ground, the Ravenclaw was just bringing her teacup to her lips, still oblivious to her changing perspective. It was the gasp from a nearby first year that finally alerted her. The younger student was staring, open-mouthed, at the spectacle of a floating schoolmate who appeared to be having a perfectly ordinary cup of tea while hovering 3 feet above the bench. The Ravenclaw froze, her teacup halfway to her mouth, and looked down. Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in rapid calculation as she assessed her situation. Fred and George, watching from a strategic position nearby, held their breath. This was the moment of truth. Would she panic, shout, demand to be released from the charm immediately? To their delight, after a brief moment of surprise, the Ravenclaw girl laughed. A bright, clear sound that seemed to cut through the gloomy atmosphere of the rainy morning like a beam of sunshine. "Well," she said, taking a calm sip of her tea despite her elevated position, "this is certainly a different perspective on breakfast." Her reaction set the tone for what followed. As more students unwittingly selected enchanted chairs and found themselves gently rising above their peers, the initial surprise quickly gave way to amusement and delight. There was something inherently joyful about floating, it seemed, something that appealed to some deep, childlike part of the human spirit that remembered dreams of flying and wished to be free from the constraints of gravity. A Hufflepuff boy spun in slow, lazy circles as he finished his toast, apparently unconcerned by his new aerial position. The pair of Slytherin second years who had sat in adjacent enchanted chairs were now playing an impromptu game of mid-air tag, their earlier morning sullenness forgotten in the simple pleasure of weightlessness. At the Gryffindor table, Neville Longbottom had risen so gradually that he hadn't noticed until he bumped his head gently against a floating candle. His startled expression quickly transformed into wonder as he realized his predicament, and though he gripped the edges of his seat with white-knuckled hands, there was unmistakable delight in his eyes as he discovered that he could propel himself in different directions with small shifts of his weight. "It's a bit like riding a very slow, very stable broom," he called down to his housemates, his usual nervousness temporarily forgotten in the novel experience of controlled floating. The staff had begun to notice the unusual activity, of course. Professor McGonagall was watching the proceedings with her characteristic blend of disapproval and reluctant amusement, her lips pressed into a thin line that didn't quite hide the twitch at the corner of her mouth. Professor Sprout appeared genuinely delighted, applauding when a particularly adventurous Hufflepuff managed a complete mid-air somersault, while still balancing his pumpkin juice. And, just as the twins had hoped, Professor Flitwick had indeed chosen the enchanted chair at the staff table. The diminutive charms professor was now floating at eye level with his standing colleagues, a position that seemed to please him immensely. Rather than attempting to counter the charm, he appeared to be analyzing it with professional interest, occasionally making small noises of approval as he noted particularly clever aspects of the spellwork. excellent variation on the standard levitation charm, he was saying to Professor Sinistra, who had to look up rather than down at him for once. Notice how it maintains stability, regardless of weight distribution. Very sophisticated for student work. Fred and George, who had positioned themselves strategically near the doors to observe the fruits of their labor, exchanged grins of satisfaction. Praise from Flitwick, however indirectly given, was high praise indeed when it came to charm work. As more students finished their breakfast and prepared to leave for classes, the hall had transformed into something resembling a slow-motion indoor Quidditch match without the goals or the competitive element. At least 20 students were now floating at various heights, some still seated primly as if determined to maintain normalcy despite their elevation, others fully embracing the experience with gentle spins and carefully controlled drifts. The atmosphere had changed completely from the dreary resignation of a rainy morning to something approaching a carnival. Laughter echoed off the ancient stone walls, and even students who hadn't encountered enchanted chairs were smiling as they watched their floating peers enjoy their unexpected flight. Sensing an opportunity to enhance the experience, Fred nudged his twin and withdrew a small paper bag from inside his robes. "In-flight refreshments?" he suggested with a grin. George nodded, and together they began circulating among the floating students, offering treats with exaggerated formality. Chocolate frog for the gentleman in the blue tie? Perhaps a fizzing whizbee for the lady from Hufflepuff? We recommend against pepper imps at this altitude. The steam can affect visibility. Their impromptu role as flight attendants only added to the festive atmosphere. Even some of the normally reserved Slytherins accepted treats with grudging smiles. Temporary house rivalries forgotten in the shared experience of magical whimsy. Outside, the rain continued to fall, beating a gentle rhythm against the windows that provided a soothing backdrop to the scene inside. But somehow, its effect had been transformed. What had been a gloomy impediment to outdoor activities was now a cozy accompaniment to an unexpectedly magical morning. The perfect weather, really, for an indoor flying adventure. As the time for first classes approached, Professor McGonagall finally decided that order needed to be restored, however reluctantly. She approached the twins with an expression that suggested she was working very hard to maintain her stern demeanor. "Mr. Weasley and Mr. Weasley," she said, addressing them both with her usual economy of distinction. "While I appreciate the creative application of charm work, I believe our aeronautical students need to return to terra firma before lessons begin." Fred adopted an expression of innocent surprise. "Us, Professor? I'm not sure what you mean." "We're simply providing refreshments to our elevated classmates," George added, holding up the bag of sweets as evidence. McGonagall's eyebrow arched so high it nearly disappeared into her hairline. "Indeed, and I suppose the chairs simply decided to defy gravity of their own accord?" The twins exchanged a look that acknowledged defeat, while simultaneously expressing no regret whatsoever. "The charm should wear off naturally within the next few minutes," Fred admitted. "We timed it to end before classes." "How considerate," McGonagall remarked dryly. 5 points from Gryffindor for unauthorized charm work." The twins nodded, accepting the token punishment with good grace. It was a small price to pay for the success of their morning entertainment. But before she turned to leave, McGonagall added something unexpected. "And 5 points to Gryffindor for exceptional charm modification and implementation. Professor Flitwick is quite impressed with the stability enchantment you incorporate." She walked away before they could respond, leaving them with matching expressions of surprised delight. Breaking even on house points, while providing a morning of joy to the entire school. That was a victory by any measure. As predicted, the floating chairs began to return to normal as the breakfast hour ended. Students descended gently to their seats, some with visible reluctance to have their aerial adventure come to an end. The Ravenclaw girl, who had been the first to float, touched down with particular grace, raising her teacup in a small salute toward the twins before gathering her books and heading for the door. "We should do a follow-up," George suggested as they watched the great hall return to its usual configuration. "Something to keep the mood going throughout the day." Fred nodded thoughtfully. Floating quills during lessons, or perhaps singing textbooks for after lunch. But before they could develop these ideas further, they were interrupted by a small delegation of younger students who had approached somewhat shyly. "That was brilliant," said a tiny Hufflepuff first year, her eyes wide with admiration. "I've never seen magic used like that before." "Just a bit of fun," Fred replied with a casual shrug, though he couldn't help but be pleased by the genuine appreciation in the young student's voice. "It made me forget about being homesick," she continued earnestly. "I've been feeling a bit down because of the rain, and suddenly everyone was floating and laughing and—" She broke off, apparently unable to fully articulate the effect the morning's magical mischief had had on her mood. George knelt down slightly to meet her eye level. "That's what magic is really for, you know," he told her with unusual seriousness. "Not just turning teacups into toads or memorizing the 12 uses of dragon's blood. It's for making ordinary days extraordinary, for bringing a bit of wonder into the world." The first year nodded solemnly, clearly filing this piece of wisdom away alongside the more conventional magical lessons she was learning in her classes. Then she smiled, a bright expression that seemed to light up her whole face, and hurried off to join her friends who were waiting by the door. The twins watched her go, feeling a different kind of satisfaction than their pranks usually provided. It was one thing to cause chaos or get a laugh. It was another entirely to realize they had genuinely brightened someone's day, had perhaps even changed in some small way how a young witch understood the purpose of magic itself. As they finally left the great hall and made their way toward their first lesson, the corridors were buzzing with talk of the floating chairs. Students who had missed the spectacle were being regaled with increasingly elaborate accounts by those who had witnessed or experienced it. The Weasley twins' names were mentioned often, with a tone that mixed exasperation and admiration in equal measure. "They'll be expecting something at lunch now," George observed, as they climbed a moving staircase that seemed unusually cooperative this morning, swinging directly toward their destination without its usual detour. "Let them wonder," Frey replied with a grin. "Sometimes anticipation is half the fun." Outside, the rain continued to fall, but its rhythm seemed different now, less dreary, more like music accompanying the day's activities. Through the windows they passed, the twins could see that the grounds, while still decidedly wet, appeared somehow fresher, more alive, as if the rain was not an inconvenience, but a nourishing gift to the earth. Inside, the castle felt warmer, more vibrant. Students moved through the corridors with more energy than they had shown at the same time yesterday. Conversations were livelier, laughter more frequent. It was as if the floating chairs had not just elevated bodies, but spirits as well, a charm that extended well beyond the physical effects of the actual spell. Their first class was Transfiguration with Professor McGonagall, who eyed them suspiciously as they entered, but made no further comment about the morning's events. The lesson proceeded normally, though Fred could have sworn he saw a smile flicker across McGonagall's face when a Ravenclaw student instinctively checked beneath her chair before sitting down. The rest of the morning passed in a similar fashion. Ordinary lessons made slightly extraordinary by the lingering effects of the floating charm. In herbology, Professor Sprout had to remind students 3 times to keep their feet on the ground while repotting bouncing bulbs. In history of magic, even Professor Binns seemed to float with slightly more animation than usual, though this might have been a coincidence, given his ghostly nature. By lunchtime, the rain had lightened somewhat, transforming from a steady downpour to a gentle patter that created a pleasant background rhythm to the meal. The great hall's enchanted ceiling showed patches of lighter grey among the clouds, hints that perhaps the weather might improve as the day progressed. Students approached their seats with a mixture of caution and hope, many clearly disappointed when they sat down and remained firmly grounded. The twins, true to their word, had not repeated the morning's charm, at least not on the chairs. Instead, they had something subtler in mind for the midday meal. As students began to eat, they might notice that their spoons, if left unattended for more than a few seconds, would rise very slightly above the table, just enough to be noticeable when reaching for them again. It was a small enchantment, a callback to the morning's more dramatic floating without disrupting the actual consumption of food. The effect was exactly what they had hoped for. Double takes, quiet laughter, knowing glances exchanged across the hall. Many students deliberately set their spoons down between bites, watching with delight as the utensils hovered expectantly above their plates, waiting to be reclaimed. It was like a tiny moment of magic that belonged to each individual, a personal reminder of the morning's shared joy. At the staff table, Professor Flitwick was clearly amused by the floating cutlery, demonstrating to Professor Sprout how one could conduct an impromptu orchestra of hovering spoons with subtle wand movements. Even Professor Snape, not known for his appreciation of Weasley-miniated Mischief, seemed to regard his levitating soup spoon with more resignation than anger, allowing it to hover beside his bowl while he focused on a book propped open beside his plate. The twins ate their own lunch with expressions of studied innocence, though they exchanged satisfied glances whenever a particularly delighted reaction caught their attention. This was a different kind of prank than their usual fare, gentler, more inclusive, designed to enhance rather than disrupt the ordinary flow of the day. After lunch came a free period which many students normally spent in the library or common rooms during inclement weather. Today, however, there was a noticeable migration toward the room of requirement on the 7th floor, a space that few students knew about, but which had somehow become common knowledge among a select group who were now heading there with purpose. Fred and George led the way, having sent word through their network of friends and admirers that something special would be happening for those who wished to continue the day's floating theme. The room, sensing their need, had transformed itself into a vast airy space with high ceilings, soft cushions scattered across the floor, and walls enchanted to display a sky far more cheerful than the actual one outside. A clear blue expanse with fluffy white clouds drifting lazily across it. "Welcome," Fred announced as students filtered in, their expressions curious and expectant, to the official Weasley Wizarding Weightless Workshop. Or, for the less alliteratively inclined, George added, an hour of controlled chaos for those who enjoyed this morning's elevated experience. They had prepared well for this impromptu event. With a wave of their wands, they activated a charm they had set up earlier, which created a localized area in the center of the room where gravity was significantly reduced, not eliminated entirely, but lessened to the point where a gentle push off the floor would send a person floating upward for several seconds before slowly descending again. "We thought some of you might have missed out this morning," Fred explained as students gathered at the edge of the enchanted area, watching as George demonstrated by taking a small leap and sailing gently upward, where he performed a lazy somersault before drifting back down. Or perhaps some of you enjoyed floating so much that you wanted another go, George continued once he had landed. Either way, the Weightless Workshop is now open for business. There was a moment of hesitation as students considered this invitation. Then a Hufflepuff fourth year, whom the twins recognized from their morning's in-flight service, stepped forward with a determined expression. She took a running start, leapt into the enchanted area and soared, her robes billowing around her like wings as she rose toward the ceiling, a cry of pure joy escaping her as she experienced the sensation of near weightlessness. Her flight broke the dam of hesitation. Soon the area was filled with floating, laughing students, some executing graceful twirls and flips, others simply enjoying the novel sensation of drifting through space with minimal effort. The twins had enchanted the ceiling and walls with gentle cushioning charms to prevent injuries, but these proved largely unnecessary. There was something about floating that brought out careful control in most people, a natural instinct to move with precision when freed from the usual constraints of gravity. From their position at the edge of the enchanted area, Fred and George watched with satisfaction as the room of requirement filled with joy and laughter. They had created a space where house affiliations seemed temporarily forgotten, where age differences mattered less than shared delight in magical experience, where the gloomy weather outside was rendered irrelevant by the simple pleasure of defying gravity together. "Not bad for a rainy day's work," Fred murmured, watching as Neville Longbottom, initially hesitant, was now performing surprisingly graceful floating pirouettes under the guidance of a patient Ravenclaw girl. "Definitely one of our better ideas," George agreed. "Less chaos than usual, but sometimes chaos isn't the point," Fred finished, understanding perfectly what his twin was trying to express. They had always prided themselves on their ability to disrupt, to challenge, to create magical mayhem that forced people out of their comfortable routines. But today had shown them another side of their talents, the ability to enhance rather than interrupt, to elevate in more ways than one, to create spaces where magic became a shared joy rather than a spectacular surprise. The hour passed quickly, filled with floating games that evolved organically among the participants. There was a version of tag that involved trying to touch someone's left ear while avoiding having one's own right elbow tagged. There was a floating dance competition judged by nearly headless Nick, who had drifted in partway through the session and declared himself qualified to evaluate aerial grace. There was even a quiet corner where some students simply floated peacefully, watching the enchanted clouds drift across the ceiling and enjoying the sensation of weightlessness. As the end of the free period approached, the twins reluctantly began to wind things down, gradually increasing the gravity in the enchanted area until students were once again firmly grounded. There were good-natured groans of disappointment, but also expressions of genuine gratitude, as people prepared to return to the ordinary routines of their school day. "That was brilliant," said a third-year Gryffindor as he reluctantly put his shoes back on. Many students had discovered that floating was more enjoyable in socked feet. "Best free period ever." "Will you do it again sometime?" asked a Slytherin girl, who had surprised everyone, including perhaps herself, with her enthusiastic participation in the floating dance competition. "Perhaps," George replied with a wink, "when the weather calls for a bit of lifting up." As the room of requirement emptied, students heading off to their afternoon lessons with lingering smiles and a visible lightness in their steps, the twins stayed behind for a moment to restore the space to its neutral state. It was a courtesy they didn't always observe in their magical mischief, but today felt different. A day for consideration and care, alongside the fun and frivolity. "We should remember this one," Fred said as they prepared to leave, "for the shop." George nodded. They had been making plans for a joke shop after leaving Hogwarts. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, they called it in their dreams, and late-night planning sessions. Thus far, their product ideas had focused primarily on items that caused spectacular effects. Fireworks, sweets that transformed the eater temporarily, magical disruptions of various entertaining kinds. But perhaps there was room in their inventory for something gentler. Products that created moments of shared joy rather than individual surprise. Weasley's Weightless Wonder, George suggested. A charm for home use that creates a floating zone in your living room. Perfect for parties, rainy days, or just because, Fred added, already envisioning the advertising copy. By the time they left the room of requirement, the corridor outside was empty, other students having already made their way to afternoon lessons. The twins weren't particularly concerned about being late. They had Defense Against the Dark Arts with Professor Lupin, who tended to be understanding about tardiness, as long as it wasn't habitual, and the latecomers caught up quickly. As they walked, they noticed that the quality of light filtering through the windows had changed. The rain had finally stopped, and while the sky remained overcast, there was a brightness to the clouds that suggested the sun was making efforts to break through. Puddles in the courtyard below reflected the pearly grey sky, and a few brave birds had emerged to splash in the fresh water. The mood inside the castle seemed to have lifted along with the rain. Students they passed in the corridors were chatting animatedly, laughing, engaging with each other in ways that had been notably absent during the previous days of downpour. There was still homework to be done, tests to study for, the usual pressures of magical education, but there was also a palpable sense of renewed energy, of spirits lifted just enough to make those ordinary challenges feel manageable again. Professor Lupin did indeed excuse their lateness with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a suggestion that they float over to the empty seats at the back of the classroom. A comment that suggested news of both the morning's charm and the free period's weightless workshop had reached the staff grapevine. The lesson on counter-jinxes proceeded normally after that, though the twins noticed that Lupin's demonstrations seemed to involve slightly more dramatic wand movements than usual, as if he too had been influenced by the day's theme of making magic just a touch more theatrical than strictly necessary. By the time classes ended for the day, the weather had improved remarkably. The clouds had thinned and separated, allowing patches of blue sky and even occasional glimpses of sunshine to break through. Students spilled out onto the grounds, eager to feel fresh air after days of confinement, their feet splashing through puddles with deliberate enjoyment rather than reluctant tolerance. The twins joined the exodus, finding a relatively dry spot beneath a large beech tree where they could watch the impromptu celebration of improved weather. Younger students were racing paper boats in the larger puddles, directing them with their wands in miniature regattas. A group of Hufflepuffs had charmed a fallen branch to absorb water and then release it as a fine mist, creating tiny rainbows wherever the sunlight hit the spray. It was this rain that meant sun brought out a stirring rain, tiny rainbows wherever the sunlight hit the spray. Even some of the more dignified seventh years seemed to be taking a moment to simply breathe deeply and turn their faces toward the breaks in the clouds. Funny, isn't it? George observed, leaning back against the tree trunk. This morning everyone was miserable about the rain. Now they're finding joy in the puddles it left behind. Perspective, Fred agreed. Sometimes you just need to see things from a different angle, he grinned. Or a different height. As evening approached, bringing with it a spectacular sunset as the last of the clouds were burnished with gold and crimson, the twins made their way back to Gryffindor Tower. The common room was lively when they entered, filled with animated conversations, and the kind of energetic buzz that had been noticeably absent during the rainy days. Jordan waved them over to their usual corner, where he was engaged in a game of exploding snap with Angelina Johnson and Katie Bell. "There they are," he announced. "The heroes of the day." "Heroes might be stretching it a bit," George demurred as they joined the group. "I don't know," Angelina replied, shuffling the cards with practiced ease. "You transformed a dreary day into something memorable. That's a kind of heroism." "More small-scale heroism," Katie added with a smile. "The everyday kind." The twins exchanged glances, not quite sure how to respond to this unexpected framing of their magical mischief. They were saved from having to reply by the arrival of Professor McGonagall, who had entered the common room to post something on the notice board. Having completed this task, she made her way over to their corner, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Weasley and Mr. Weasley," she said, her tone as precise as ever. "I have been asked by Professor Flitwick to convey his professional admiration for this morning's levitation charm variant. He has suggested that you might consider documenting the modifications you made to the standard spell for the Charms Club's reference collection." The twins stared at her in astonishment. This was far from the usual response to their magical activities. "He was particularly impressed by the stability enchantment," McGonagall continued, "and the gradual activation trigger. Both apparently involve sophisticated charm theory that is not typically mastered until Newt level." "Thank you, Prof," Fred managed, his surprise evident. "We'd be happy to share the spell details with Professor Flitwick." "See that you do," McGonagall nodded briskly. Then, just as she was turning to leave, she added, "And perhaps in the future, your considerable talents might occasionally be directed toward officially sanctioned magical activities, just for variety's sake." With that parting comment, which contained what might almost have been a hint of humor, she swept out of the common room, leaving the twins in a state of bemused pride. It wasn't often that their magical experiments received faculty approval, implicit or otherwise. "Documented for the Charms Club," George said wonderingly once McGonagall had gone. "That's practically respectable." "Dangerous territory," Fred agreed with mock solemnity. "We'll have to do something properly chaotic soon to balance it out." But they both knew that today's success, the floating chairs, the weightless workshop, the subtle joy they had spread throughout the castle, had shown them something important about their magical abilities and ambitions. Chaos and disruption were well and good, but there was equal power in enchantments that enhanced rather than interrupted, that created spaces for shared delight rather than individual surprise. As the evening progressed and the common room gradually emptied, students heading up to their dormitories with yawns and murmured good nights, the twins remained in their corner, making notes for Professor Flitwick but also sketching ideas for future magical mischief that might follow this gentler, more inclusive pattern. Outside the windows, stars had emerged in a sky now completely clear of clouds, their light reflecting in the puddles that still dotted the grounds below. The moon rose, nearly full, casting a silver glow over the castle and transforming the rain-washed world into something ethereal and peaceful. Inside, the fire burned low in the grate, casting warm, flickering light over the now empty common room. The twins worked on in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging a word or a nod, their thoughts flowing together as seamlessly as always. They had begun the day with a simple goal: to lift spirits during gloomy weather with a bit of magical levity. They had succeeded beyond their expectations, not just in the immediate joy they had created, but in the ripple effects that had spread throughout the castle. The changed perspectives, the shared experiences, the moments of wonder that had transformed an ordinary rainy day into something memorable. It was, they reflected, as they finally gathered their notes and prepared for bed, perhaps their most successful magical mischief yet, not because it had been the most spectacular or surprising, but because it had created the most genuine happiness. There was a lesson in that, about magic and its purposes, about the kind of wizards they wanted to be, about the legacy they hoped to leave at Hogwarts and beyond. As they climbed the spiral staircase to their dormitory, the day's events settling into memory, the twins shared a final thought without needing to speak it aloud. Sometimes the best magic wasn't about changing the world dramatically, but about lifting it gently. Just enough to remind everyone that ordinary life, seen from a slightly different perspective, could be extraordinary after all. And in a castle dedicated to teaching the grand and powerful aspects of wizardry, perhaps that was the most important magic of all, the kind that found wonder in rainy days, joy in floating chairs, connection in shared experiences, and light in even the gloomiest of circumstances. It was the magic that had always come most naturally to Fred and George Weasley. The ability to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary through nothing more complicated than imagination, creativity, and the generous desire to share delight with others. As they drifted towards sleep, the sound of gentle rain returning to patter against the dormitory windows, the twins carried this knowledge with them like a charm, one that would continue to shape their magical mischief in the days, months, and years to come, lifting spirits and creating moments of wonder in a world that sometimes forgot the power of simple joy. Our magical journey through Hogwarts comes to a close for tonight. Now you'll hear the gentle crackling of the common room fire and soothing ambient sounds of the castle to accompany you as you drift off to sleep. These calming sounds will continue without any advertisements or interruptions. May your dreams be filled with magic and wonder, and may you sleep as peacefully as if you were tucked away in your cozy four-poster bed in the dormitory. Good night, dear witch or wizard, until our next adventure in the wizarding world.